The witch trials that happened here, these are the most famous witch trials anywhere in the world, and they're incredibly minor compared to most witch trials in the history of the world. Most of the witches that were put to death, or the people that were put to death for witchcraft, they were put to death in southern Germany. There were many witch trials in southern Germany, and they were putting people to death, especially during the 30 Years' War. The way that you get to the point where you're doing witch trials, it usually requires the rejection of the sovereignty of God. You know, Exodus does say that witches are to be put to death. Do not suffer a witch to live. But what happens when you get witch trials is people aren't trusting in God's procedures. What they see is they see phenomenon that they can't explain, and then they become fearful, and out of that fear they respond by starting to kill, typically fairly randomly. Typically the outsiders in the society, the widow who lives by herself. This is why, you know, this is kind of the picture of the witch, the person that's very solitary. From like 1400 to the beginning of the 1800s, the estimates are 40 to 60,000 witches were put to death in the Americas and in Europe. So the, 17 or 19 that are put to death here are pretty minor compared to what has happened other places in the world. But because of things that happened in America afterwards, these become the famous ones throughout the world, even though they were pretty much the end of the wave of putting, you know, of witch hunts, so to speak. So the witch hunts start in 1563, the modern witch hunts, where it's, and again, this is in Weissensteig, Germany, which is in southern Germany. And then in Norway, they start to do, there's hundreds of witches are put to death in the 17th century in Norway. And 70 witches are put to death in East Lothian, Scotland, because James VI, who later becomes James I, he's going to pick his bride up, Princess Anne of Denmark, and storms arise because they've rejected the idea of the sovereignty of God. Even though James VI was taught by Buchanan, he was taught Orthodox theology, but he was in rebellion to it. They get trapped. They think that they're not going to be able to get back. They end up after a couple weeks being able to get back, but they decide that this is because of witches. And so because of that, they start to put people to death. They put people to death first in Denmark, and then it spreads and they come back to Scotland, and they end up putting 60 witches to death in Scotland, or 70 witches to death in Scotland, all because these storms arose. And so because they're not seeing it as from the hand of God, they start to see it as from the hand of devils, basically. And so James VI is always a big advocate. Again, James I of England, he's always a big advocate of witch hunts. And so he even writes a book called Demonologia, which is basically the study of demons, in that he is like one of the famous people that is pushing forward for witch hunts. And he writes in there, experience daily proves how loath they are to confess without torture. So he's one of the first people that is really pushing, you don't do any rules, none of the biblical rules for justice, because they're witches, therefore they don't have any right, so you just torment them until they confess to what they've quote unquote done. And their torture, which I'm sure we'll hear later, the torture that they do here, the idea is, well, they're a witch, so you can torture them however you want to get them to confess that they're a witch. It's really a very blind view of the world, and a very, very much rejecting that God is a just God and that our duty is to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly before God. The witch hunts are like the exact opposite of that. So during the English Civil War, again, there's other things happening. People are very disturbed, so in that disturbance they see things happening and they start to associate it with witches. And so during the English Civil War, there's a man called Matthew Hopkins that becomes famous as the witch finder general. And so what he does is he ends up being directly associated with 300 witches being convicted and put to death. He wrote a book saying, here's how you test for a witch. And there were 3 tests for a witch. One was that they had a witch's mark. The idea of a witch's mark is when Satan was capturing them as a witch, his claws would claw them, and if you strip them naked, they would frequently do this in public with women, they would strip them naked and they would search their body for scrapes. And they would say that that was a witch's mark, and that was a sign that they were taken by Satan. Another wonderful test that they would use to justly decide if they were witches or not was the swimming test. The typical punishments for men were like to be scourged or things like that, but one of the typical punishments for women is that they would have what's called a dunking chair. They would strap them to a chair over a river to punish, and they would dunk them into the river. And so they decided to modify this to test for witches, in that they would take the chair off and they would tie the woman to it, and they would throw the woman into the river or the pond. And if she floated, then she was a witch, and if she drowned, then she wasn't a witch. So this was the test for witchcraft that he came up with, this Hopkins. Which, right, we hear these things and we think how insane they are, but we shouldn't think we're that far off. You hear all these people that freak out because of UFOs. It's no different. It's the same thing. You see a phenomenon that you don't understand, and you go, oh no, look at all these things that are happening, instead of trusting in God and trusting in His ways. So we shouldn't think, oh, look how modern we are and look how primitive they are. It's all the same reaction when you reject God, as you have nothing else to explain the world with. And then the last one was called the piercing test. And what they would do is, especially where the witch's mark was, that they would stick something in, because allegedly when Satan scratched you, it would make that area numb, so you couldn't feel anything there. So they would allegedly take like a pike and stick it in there. The problem is, they found out later they had fake pikes that you know, have you ever seen where they have the things where you like hit them and it looks like it's going to punch in, but it actually has a spring in it? So they would do that, or they would have blades that they would flip around where one end was very sharp and the other end was dull, and they would go, oh look, you can stab it in and there's no mark. I mean, they were framing these women, typically women. There were men that were put to death for witchcraft too, but they were framing them because they were using the paranoia, the fear in the society to say, here's the solution, put these people to death. So that's one thing that's going on. And then another element that I wanted to talk to is what's going on in Salem. Because we're not in Salem right now, we're actually in Danvers. Because Danvers used to be called Salem Village. In Salem, which we think of as Salem, that was Salem town. And so what happened is, in 1626, once they come here and they start to settle, you get two very distinct groups of people. You get the people that are working in the port, the people that are shipbuilders, the people that are dealing with cargo, the people that are in a town, and that's Salem town. And then you get a bunch of people that go out into the suburbs that are farmers. And so there becomes this, you know, the townspeople versus the farmers. This is like at the heart of it, right? Because these are an attack that people are using witchcraft to attack the other side. And so where we are is in the village. We're in the outskirts. But anyway, so by the time the witch trials are coming on, what happens is Salem Village is they're all under the same governance, because the town is the governance and so the village isn't. But about a third of the people are farmers out in the village and 2/3 are in the town. Everybody in the village had to walk to where Salem is every Sunday. They didn't want that, they wanted their own church. So they finally get permission, and this creates a lot of animosity because the townspeople didn't want them to have their own church. They wanted the church to be in town where they could control it, where they could get the tithes and everything. And so the farmers didn't want to have to walk to town every Sunday. And so what happens is that you get this arguing back and forth, and finally they agree to have a church here, but it ends up that they never get an ordained minister. And without an ordained minister, you can't actually have members to the church. They were still forced to be members in the Salem town church, even though they were going to church here. And without an ordained minister, they couldn't do the Lord's Supper, so if they ever wanted to do the Lord's Supper, they still had to go to Salem town. Deodat Lawson is the first one, and they promise that they'll ordain him. They can't come to consensus. And for the church to ordain him, he has the training that he can be ordained, but the church actually has to ordain him. And there's enough people that don't like him and enough people that do like him that they're fighting over whether he'll be ordained or not. They promised him to give him this house, they claimed that they just said he could live in this house. And so after 5 years of the people in Salem Village fighting with each other, finally Lawson leaves and goes, these people are hopeless. And that's when Samuel Parris comes, and he's the one whose daughter ends up being one of the witnesses that was for the Salem witch trials. But so these are the kind of the two things that are going on that end up, or the three things. One is the rejection of the sovereignty of God. One is that this witch hysteria has been going on worldwide. And then the last one is the tension that's between the town and the villages before the witchcraft stuff ends up creating the Salem witch trials.
Why are we here? There were perhaps up to 60,000 people who were executed for witchcraft in the preceding few centuries. You know, there were examples where in a rather short time period there were up to 1,000 people executed all over Europe. These trials were tiny, where you have 19 people being executed. So why are these world famous? One reason is these do come towards the end of this witch trial movement, and they were the biggest in American history. In the New World, this is the biggest example you can find. It's also a pretty manageable number. There's a quote that's attributed probably falsely to Stalin that one death is a tragedy, but a million deaths is a statistic. So you have 20 deaths here, you can read about these people, you can learn their names, you can get a handle on 20 people being executed. 1,000 people, there's a part where it doesn't have as much resonance. Another reason is that people at the time understood that what was going on here was wrong. You had people speaking out against it even then. And you had efforts by the people in power to cover up what was going on here and what had gone on here so that people would know about it. And as often happens, I think there's a sense in which this effort to cover it up backfired and made these witch trials be more well known and more infamous. And the last reason, it's a great way to attack the Puritans. People don't like the theology of the Puritans, and this is the best example they can find as to why Puritanism was evil. And so it's an interesting and exciting story, so it gets talked about a lot. But I think as people who sympathize with Puritan theology, it's a good thing to study, it's a good thing to think about, a good thing to learn from. As in many ways, the theology of the people who are here executing witches was pretty sound. And so we should study it and make sure that we don't go wrong in the same way that they did. Salem Village had a bit of a reputation before these trials even took place. It was a contentious place. They had trouble finding and keeping ministers in the church. Twice in 20 years, they ended up in court with their pastor. That's something that today would be very unusual. Twice, with two different pastors over 20 years, they are in court. The people are reluctant to pay their pastor. So in the year 1692, Samuel Parris is the pastor. He had been there a little over a year, and of course we are standing in front of the foundation of his house. And he had come there only after extensive negotiation, monetary negotiation, how much he was going to be paid, where he was going to live, all these things. He had worked it out, whether it was because of his own motivations for getting into it, whether it's because of the reputation that Salem had, but he had been very careful to make sure that everything was squared away before getting involved. There are also some pretty severe religious tensions in the church over theology. A lot of this was over the halfway covenant. When Parris comes to Salem, he rolls back the halfway covenant. It had been adopted as a church that they were going to bring in or baptize into membership the children of people whose parents were not members of the church. He eliminates that and will no longer baptize these children. So the problems begin, the witchcraft problems begin here in Parris's own house, the house of the pastor. And it begins with two young women or girls, with his daughter, Betty, who is age 9, and his niece, Abigail, who is age 11. And they began to experience some strange symptoms, some things that the doctors didn't recognize. And so they consult the doctors and they say this is supernatural. To summarize it, they were saying that they were being physically tormented by someone who wasn't there, who they couldn't see. So let's just talk about the mindset of the people at this time. At the time, virtually everyone believed in witches, they believed in demons. They believed in a supernatural world. And they had a lot of specific ideas about how that was manifest. They believed that witches were people who had made a covenant with the devil, and that those witches then went on to torment other people. People sometimes who were in their presence, sometimes who were not in their presence. They thought there were marks on the skin whereby you could identify a witch. There were a lot of patterns and motifs of witchcraft. Things like the idea that a witch could not say the Lord's Prayer. They could not say those words. And they had a big list of things that how to identify a witch, things that you do not find in Scripture. The Scripture talks about witches, but it does not include all these marks of a witch that they were operating off of and that they were executing people based on. Another big thing at the time was counter magic or good magic. Spells or recipes or certain things you did, different superstitions to ward off evil spirits or to ward off witches. Now, good magic was condemned by the Puritans, by and large. This is not something that they supported, but it was something that went on because even though this was nominally a Puritan society, there were a lot of people here who didn't follow everything the pastor said. And it seemed to me like there was more of this superstition than there is today, at least in certain ways. I mean, we have our own superstitions, but the particular physical things that they were superstitious of, I think it was more common at that time. So you have these two young girls. You have things happening to them that people can't explain. The doctors say it's supernatural. So there was a neighbor, Mary Sibley, and she recommended that they use this counter magic that I was just describing. She was a church member and she wanted to figure out what was happening to these girls and what witch in their community was tormenting them. And so there were two servants that Paris had in his home. So these were likely from Barbados. His father had had a plantation there from the Caribbean. And so he has these two servants, Tituba and John Indian. Well, they performed this quote-unquote good magic. And Sibley ends up confessing to what she had done, that she had recommended that this magic be used and participated in it. Tituba confessed as well, though she denied being an actual witch. So this is an important moment in the story of the witchcraft trials, because they know now that witchcraft and magic is real in Salem. At a bare minimum, there had been this attempt to figure out who a witch was, but that attempt using magic is witchcraft. 3 people have been discovered practicing witchcraft. They had confessed, and what happens is there's no consequences to any of these 3 people. Sibley was publicly rebuked in the church, but Paris says, oh, she did it ignorantly. But he does condemn this in the church, saying that you cannot be going to the devil for help against the devil. But this is where things are going to be wrong, because if we're going to punish people for witchcraft, here's your opportunity. Here's people who have confessed to practicing witchcraft and nothing really happened to them. And as we go through the rest of the story, there's a pattern. The numbers are very clear. No one who confessed was executed. On the other hand, everyone who was tried and refused to confess was executed, except for one man, Samuel Wardwell, who made a confession, retracted it, and was executed. And that includes one man who died while they were trying to force a confession. So this was not necessarily their plan, because as we're going to hear, these trials were cut short by the government, and it is very likely that those who confessed would have been executed eventually anyway for the witchcraft, because that confession didn't mean that they wouldn't be held to account. But the reality was, for the people involved in these trials, you look at what is happening and you see if you refuse to confess, you get executed. If you confess and say, "Oh, I can tell you some other people who are also witches," you're gonna live a little bit longer. Perhaps you're gonna survive. As that happened, that gives an obvious motivation for people to falsely confess. Even people who knew they were innocent, even people who knew that others they were accusing were innocent, they are seeing they can save their life by confessing, because they confessed and it did save their life. The judges were encouraging them to accuse others, and it worked for every single one of them. You have one supposed witch who is condemned to death. They then confess, and their execution is delayed, and eventually they're not executed. So when you see things like that happening in your community, the motivation is super obvious. If you want to survive, confess to witchcraft. So going back to what's happening here, to these girls that are afflicted, these mysterious afflictions begin to spread. And the sufferers begin to accuse particular people, including Tituba, the servant of Paris, the pastor. She's arrested. She confesses to witchcraft. And confessed not just to this quote-unquote good magic that she said before. Now she's saying, yes, I'm a witch, I'm in contract with the devil, all of these things. They go on to investigate others, to arrest them, and obtain confessions from them. So, why would people falsely confess to witchcraft, apart from that, the later motivation they have, knowing that you can get off and not be executed? Why would people falsely confess? So if you look into it, even today, people falsely confess all the time. If pressure is put on them by authorities, they can testify things that at first might seem impossible for them to know. Because the investigators, the people looking into it, questioning them, can feed them information, sometimes unwittingly. They can actually feed them information, and then the information gets parroted back. And gets confirmed when they're right and denied when they're wrong. So it ends up where, they write out their confession, and it seems like, how they even know these things? How are they, confessing all this stuff? In fact, they may have had nothing to do with it entirely. 29% of DNA exonerations in the United States, which is about as foolproof as you can get, where, the DNA of the criminals left on the scene, someone confessed, and then later they go back and test it once they have the technology and they realize, oh, it was someone entirely different who did it. So 29% of those cases where the false person had been convicted in our courts, that included a false confession. So about a third of the time, the person confessed falsely. The same thing that happens in America today, in the last few decades. Same thing was happening back in the 1600s. People are the same elements influence people, the same elements affect people, and so you have people falsely confessing to witchcraft, just like people falsely confess to all manner of crimes today. So the Puritan leaders, Paris and the other people, they are taking this very seriously. They want to do this right. They consult with theologians, with other people. They study books that have been published on the subject of witchcraft. They're not going into this, trigger happy, necessarily wanting to execute people. But that didn't mean that their approach wasn't completely wrong and completely on the wrong basis. Looking back with hindsight, we can see the areas where they went wrong, and we can see that this was a mass hysteria, which there's a lot of interesting examples that have taken place, that aren't witchcraft related. Where just strange diseases can go through societies and can begin to affect people when there's not a physical cause, where there was a physical cause in one instance, but other people hear what's going on and end up having the same symptoms, but it's only caused by their mind. Hundreds of years later, we can't know exactly what was going on in Salem. We can't know how much true witchcraft there was and how much demonic activity there may have been, but we can know that a lot of this stuff were false accusations, and there were a lot of things that were done wrongly, and we can definitely learn from that. We're here at the Old Burying Point in Salem, one of the oldest graveyards in America. We're going to pick up the story of the Salem witch trials here. Some of the people involved in this trial are buried in this graveyard. So we go to the end of March 1692. We have all these accusations beginning, starting in the Paris household, the pastor in Salem, and spreading to other people. People saying they're having all these symptoms and that people are cursing them, witches are cursing them. So people begin to be arrested. Eventually this is going to rise up so that over 100 people were arrested for witchcraft in Salem. So May 27th, the governor finally responds, and he establishes what's called the Court of Oyer and Terminer. That is Old French. It comes from an Old French phrase meaning hear and determine. So this is the court that's supposed to decide all these cases, a special court, composed of prominent citizens, including John Hawthorne, ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne. And Nathaniel Hawthorne is a famous novelist in Salem, one of the most famous novelists in all of American history, and his novels are going to contain a lot of anti-Puritan themes. Another one of the judges is Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, so he's pretty powerful in Massachusetts, And another one is Samuel Sewall. He is pretty famous. He wrote a famous diary from that time. So as they're deciding how they're going to handle this situation that they have with all these people in jail for witchcraft, is that they decide they're going to allow what was called spectral evidence. And this is a momentous and a controversial decision. Spectral evidence means that that if someone says, I am being tormented by someone's spirit, that can be used as evidence that that person is committing witchcraft, the person they're accusing of haunting them. So it's evidence that is just determined by someone saying that something spiritual is happening to them, and not any physical witness or anything of that nature to it actually happening. One of the major criticisms of spectral evidence from the time is that, okay, so assuming that this person is being honest, that they saw someone coming to haunt them and torment them. But how do you know that this is actually true? Scripture says that demons disguise themselves as angels of light. Couldn't a demon disguise himself as some upstanding person and then put the blame for this torment on that person? So that's one of the major things. Can you trust what people see in a vision? Could they have been deceived, even if the vision actually happened? So they end up accepting this evidence. It is a very unusual standard of evidence even for the time. Even the same judges that were on this court, they had used different standards of evidence, higher standards at other times. And this is one reason why people end up calling it a hysteria, is that because this really bad thing is happening, all these people being tormented, they're going to lower their standards and say, we just have to get people convicted and change our standards of evidence to do it. One of the reasons that the trials come to an end is that eventually, after people are executed, they decide to reject spectral evidence, and that greatly reduces the number of accusations and number of convictions. So, of course, spectral evidence poses big problems, because how do you disprove a false accusation? Imagine today if spectral evidence could be used to convict people. You would have thousands of people accusing any leading person of haunting them. You know, Trump, Biden, all these people would be being accused of witchcraft. So if you're going to accept it, you're going to have to deal with that, because you have all these witnesses. You'd have thousands of witnesses saying these people need to be executed. That actually happened at that time. But what they did is, when people accused people that were too prominent and too influential in society, they would say, well, they must be mistaken, we're not going to pursue that person as a witch. So even then, they had to deal with that problem, and their standard was not consistent, saying that all evidence needs to be weighed equally. It was if you were using spectral evidence against someone who, well, yeah, they kind of seem like a witch, it could be used against them, but not against someone who was powerful in society. The more people who are arrested for witchcraft, the more people confess and begin to accuse others. The more people complaining of being tormented by other witches. You have people where they say they're being tormented, and then they accuse someone, that person's arrested, that person's even executed, and then suddenly that person is still tormented, but now it's by someone else, and the process continues. So the court runs from May until October 29th, when the governor dissolves it, and because it had been realized that what was happening was wrong. Some prisoners were released immediately, more arrests are forbidden, and another court ended up convicting 3 more women of witchcraft, but they are pardoned by the governor. By that time, 22 people had been convicted of witchcraft. 14 women were executed and 5 men. 5 others died in jail, although not convicted. More had been sentenced to death but were not executed because the trials were put to an end. So I want to talk about one person in particular who was killed without being convicted. This man's name was Giles Corey. He was an 81-year-old farmer from Salem. His wife had been arrested, and he, in fact, had been caught up in the hysteria in his community, and he actually believed that she was guilty. He believed the accusations until he was accused himself, and he said, I know I'm not a witch, so I no longer believe my wife is a witch either. He actually refused to plead innocent or guilty. So the law at the time required you to plead innocent or guilty. You couldn't refused to say either one. And the law allowed you to be tortured to force you to plead innocent or guilty. He was ordered to be tortured, a board was placed on his chest, and rocks were gradually piled on him over a long period of time, increasing that weight. For 2 days he was kept here, and when they asked him what he wanted to plead, all he would say is more weight. And finally he dies. It was very rare to be pressed to death because torture works, not in the sense of getting the truth, but torture works about getting people to talk, especially because to even say you're innocent, he believed he was innocent, and so why wouldn't he say it? Why would he die before saying it? And the reason he didn't is because according to the law, because he had not pled guilty or innocent, the trial could not go forward. Because he had not been convicted, his estate was not seized by the government, so he could pass it on to his children. So he basically allowed himself to be tortured to death so that his children could receive their inheritance. In all, at least 156 people were accused of witchcraft in this time period. 113 were arrested and 20 executed, including Corey. So if you look at the people who were accused and the people who were the accusers, you start to see some connections. You see that the accusers are accusing people who their families had feuds with. One of them was a former pastor of Salem, and he ends up being killed. Even though he's a pastor, he's killed for witchcraft. And remember, Salem was a very contentious town. You can imagine that families were talking about this and people were hearing it. And a lot of the accusers, though not all, a lot of them were girls. You remember it started with 9 and 11-year-olds. You have a lot of young women, a lot of girls playing a huge role in this. And a big factor of this must have been hearing things talked about, hearing gossip in the home, and then eventually that turns into accusations of witchcraft, and that turns into people dying. So there was a man in Salem named John Proctor. He had a servant girl named Mary Warren, and she had these symptoms that a lot of people were having of being tormented. And this is what he said: "If they were let alone, we should all be devils and witches quickly. They should rather be had to the whipping post. When she was first taken with fits, I kept her close for a while and threatened to thrash her. And then she had no more fits till the next when I was gone forth." So he's saying basically they just need to be punished and then they will stop having these fits. And what do you know? He and his wife are both accused of witchcraft by his servant Mary along with others. And they're convicted. Even though they, like a lot of the other people who were convicted, 32 neighbors wrote in support of them saying these are good people, these are not witches. John was executed. His wife Elizabeth, she was pregnant when she was convicted, so she was allowed to give birth. By the time she gives birth, by that time the trial was ended and she was spared. John Alden was accused. He was the son of John Alden and Priscilla Mullins from Plymouth, and he ends up escaping prison. By the time he returns, the trials were over, so he escapes punishment. Like I said, people of too high social standing who were accused, it was just let slide. Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of the governor, was accused. She was not convicted, she was not tried, she was not executed. Because in that case, we all know, of course, the accuser must be mistaken. So while this court is still in session, word gets out about what's going on and begins to spread. People realize that things were getting worse and not better. There were more accusations and not less. They could not believe that there was this much witchcraft in a Puritan town. One big factor playing into all of this is that it was a very important time in Massachusetts history. The king had just revoked the charter of Massachusetts, and they were lobbying William and Mary for a new charter. Governor Phipps, the governor of Massachusetts, he is allied with Increase Mather, an influential Puritan pastor. Phipps and Mather did not want to embarrass Massachusetts about having this big witchcraft-ish problem with witchcraft and risk getting that charter revoked and having the government set up with more control from England. Increase Mather's son is Cotton Mather, also a pretty influential person. He did not fully endorse the trials. he had certain concerns about them at times. He had concerns about the use of spectral evidence, and these are things that he was talking about, he was advising people on. But he did publish a book to defend them called Wonders of the Invisible World. And some people have called this a cover-up, and that he was in a conspiracy, or he was influenced by the governor to say, let's cover this up, let's say whatever is happening here was fine, was dealt with properly, but then what we're going to do is we're going to end the trials and not let them proceed. So a lot of people were concerned with the trials, but what they did was they worked to end the trials and then worked to suppress them and not let the word get out. But there were people who were standing up and saying people need to know what went on here in Salem. One of these men was Robert Califf. He was a weaver. He collected his own evidence. He got transcripts of the trials, and he ends up publishing a book called More Wonders of the Invisible World. But because the governor and the Mathers were working against letting this word get out, letting the truth of what happened here get out, he had to get it published over in London and shipped back to the colonies. So, as I said, people were realizing that what happened was wrong. And there were movements toward repentance. The governor proclaimed a fast day on January 14th, 1697, a few years after the trials. And this is what he said when proclaiming the fast day. God is pleased to still go on in diminishing our substance, cutting short our harvest, blasting our most promising undertakings in more ways than one, unsettling us, although considering the many sins prevailing in the midst of us. We cannot but wonder at the patience and mercy moderating these rebukes. And he told them to pray that he would shew us what we know not, especially that whatever mistakes on either hand have been fallen into, either by the body of this people or any orders of men, referring to the late tragedy raised among us by Satan and his instruments through the awful judgment of God. So there he's publicly saying, God, show us the mistakes that we made in dealing with this trial, whether it was in the people or in the rulers. Samuel Sewall, as I said, he was a judge. He was from Salem, and he was convicted that he had sinned as a judge. And he actually saw the hand of God in judging him in his life. He had a 2-year-old daughter named Sarah, and between the governor proclaimed the fast and the day of the fast, his daughter died. And so the fast day, he gave a paper, he wrote up a paper to be read in the church, saying, Samuel Sewall, sensible of the reiterated strokes of God upon himself and his family, and being sensible that as to the guilt contracted on the opening of the late commission of Aurier and Terminer in Salem, he desires to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men, and especially desiring prayers that God, who has unlimited authority, would pardon that sin. So he's realizing, he's saying, I did wrong, put the blame upon me, I'm repenting of my sins in this matter. 12 jury members also publicly and jointly repented. They said in part, we confess that we ourselves were not capable to understand nor able to withstand the mysterious delusions of the powers of darkness. We fear we have been instrumental with others, though ignorantly and unwittingly, to bring upon ourselves and this people of the Lord the guilt of innocent blood. We do therefore humbly beg forgiveness, first of all, of God for Christ's sake. We do heartily ask forgiveness of you all, whom we have justly offended. So they also are repenting and saying, we were deceived, we acted wrongly, and because of that, innocent blood was shed. So I'll just finish up with one of the actual accusers, Ann Putnam. She was the only accuser that there's records of her repenting. She was one of the primary accusers. In 1699, after the trials, her parents died. She had to raise her younger siblings, and she never married. And before she could join the church, had to profess her faith, and she wrote a confession to be read in the church. She said this, I then being in my childhood, by such a providence of God, was made an instrument for the accusing of several people for grievous crimes, whereby their lives were taken away from them, whom now I have just grounds and good reason to believe they were innocent persons. I did it not out of any anger, malice, or ill will to any person, for I had no such thing against any one of them. But what I did was ignorantly, being deluded by Satan. I desire to lie in the dust and to be humble for it, and that I was a cause with others of so sad a calamity to them and their families. For which cause I desire to lie in the dust, and earnestly beg forgiveness of God, and from all those unto whom I have given just cause of sorrow and offense, whose relations were taken away or accused. So she's repenting. She's saying that she was deceived by Satan. She is asking forgiveness for those who would have been in that church whose families had died because of her accusation. And so this was accepted by the church, accepted by at least some of the family members of the victims, and she's brought into church membership. One interesting kind of epilogue to this is that it seems, if you look at the court records, that this time of year, all these accusations, primarily by women, ended up rendering as such that women's accusations of men committing crimes were not believed as much after these years, which is an unfortunate thing, as that people were not trusting the accusations that people were making. When you look at the number of crimes that were prosecuted before and after this time, not for witchcraft but for other things, it seemed like it put women as a whole in the society in bad repute, saying, who knows, maybe these are just more false accusations.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and share it with your friends. You can also visit www.discerninghistory.com for more videos and other resources.